This decrease in thrust can affect the performance of the airplane depending on the weight and the altitude. So the performance study showed that the airplane was perfectly safe to fly at 33,000 feet with the anti-ice off.
Anti-ice on, please.
However, it could only fly as high as 31,900 feet with the anti-ice on.
It was the anti-icing.
Robbed them of the power they needed.
They shouldn't have gone higher than 31.9.
La conclusión a que llega el equipo de investigación.
We concluded that the aircraft was flown too high for its weight and the weather conditions it faced.
Eso y las condiciones que tenía todo el vuelo.
Put them on.
The airspeed started to decelerate when the flight crew turned on the anti-ice system. This reduced the thrust of the engine.
Investigators conclude the reduction in thrust led the plane to stall.
Sir, we just got the final load sheet.
They now assume that when Captain Ospina calculated his maximum cruise altitude, he failed to factor in the need for anti-icing. But if low thrust led to a stall, why didn't the crew notice? Part of the answer is that while the problem was developing, they weren't flying the plane.
They had their autopilot on.
The autopilot should not let a plane stall. Investigators wonder why this particular autopilot let that happen. While researching the autopilot on the MD-82, they discover a bulletin from the plane's manufacturer. It was sent to the airline 3 years earlier.
Under some conditions, airspeed could decay to stall warning before the autopilot disconnects.
El boletín que emitió Boeing.
In the bulletin issued by Boeing, it described another incident with an autopilot that was almost the exact same as what had happened with West Caribbean.
Prácticamente idéntica.
The bulletin warned crews that if they set the autopilot to maintain the plane's altitude, they should keep a close eye on their airspeed.
The operation bulletin warned that with the autopilot on and at altitude, that a similar situation could occur, where the aircraft could maintain altitude and airspeed could decrease if the pilots were not monitoring the airspeed.
So in order to maintain altitude, as the speed goes down, the aircraft starts to pitch up, nose up altitude, increasing the angle of attack to have a better lift. But that has a problem because you cannot exceed certain angle because you can enter stall condition.
In this case, the autopilot led the aircraft into a condition that caused an excessive angle of attack. That generated the stall.
As important as the bulletin was, there's no evidence that it ever reached West Caribbean's pilots. Investigators now have a deeper understanding of the events causing the stall. The crew were not monitoring their instruments, believing that the autopilot would maintain the correct speed. They were wrong. It was at this moment that the captain began to notice that something wasn't right.
Can't accelerate.
But what did that through? That they were aware that they had a problem, but they didn't know why.
The captain decided to descend to an altitude where the engines would perform better.
10. And descending to 31,000 feet was the right choice. That's why he disconnected the autopilot to begin the descent.
Give me 310.
The plane is very close to stalling, but the crew was just a few seconds away from overcoming the problem.
If he would have attained 31,000 feet, during that descent, the speed would have gone up and he would have recovered the lift, and after leveling off, there will have been no problem at all.
They almost made it. But the captain was oblivious to his biggest threat. The plane is still traveling slowly, with its nose raised at a dangerously high angle. That's when the crew experienced some bad luck. The weather they were flying through was turbulent. Winds were intense, and the plane was vulnerable.
Our study showed that it would only take a 20-mile-an-hour updraft to push the aircraft into a stall.
Investigators conclude that the plane was hit with a ferocious updraft that lifted the plane's nose just enough to put it into a stall. A crisis the crew then mishandled.
The captain was not telling the first officer what to do. The captain was only fixating, or if you will, have tunnel vision on the engines, which is a very big problem in this situation.
As the investigation into the crash of Flight 708 nears completion, only one mystery remains unsolved.
Munoz seems to know what was happening.
Why did the crew fail to recover from a stall that they'd been trained to overcome?
To get out of a stall, a pilot should increase thrust and pitch over, that is, push forward on the control column.
But as the recovered flight data shows, that is not what Captain Ospina did.
He's pulling back on the control column.
At that point, it was impossible to recover from the stall.
The captain should have pushed forward. The question remains, why didn't he? Investigators get their first clue when they re-examine the engine data at the moment of the stall.
That's what distracted the captain.
At the time that the airplane stalled, we also saw that both engines rolled back at the same time. This most likely confused the pilots.
When airflow to the engines is disrupted, it causes a rollback, reducing thrust.
Because of the updrafts that in the area, it most likely increased the angle of attack of the engine inlet, which then caused the engines rolled back.
With his engine power temporarily reduced, the captain wrongly concluded that his engines had quit.
It's a stall!
First officer yelled, "It's a stall capping. It's a stall." There was no response from the captain. This showed that the captain was fixating most likely on the engines.
Unaware he had stalled, the captain made things worse by pulling back on his control column. That kept the nose of the plane angled dangerously high.
Tell them we've had a flame on both engines! We've had a flame on both engines!
La tripulación no supo
The crew couldn't understand the situation presented to them.
que se les presentó.
West 708, go down to level 240.
Do you have a problem on board?
We've had a flame on both engines!
They had a heavy buffet from the stall. They were looking at the engines, which were rolled back, and they were also communicating with the air traffic controller. During that time, there was not much troubleshooting going on in the cockpit. This was a very, very difficult time for the pilot.
It is very important that the crews communicate in an effective way. And in this case, you don't hear the two pilots communicating between themselves.
Y no hubo comunicación efectiva entre ellos.
It was an almost silent cockpit
Era casi que
until the time just before the accident,
hasta el momento que
when they realized they were in deep trouble.
del accidente se dieron cuenta que estaban en graves problemas.
But by that time, it was already too late. They were past the point of no return.
During that descent, according to the flight data recorder, they reached a rate of descent, an average of more than 12,000 feet per minute. That rate of descent, not only the G-force will prevent them from any coordinated action, the vibration in the aircraft will be a lot. That's why when you hear the voice recorder, you hear the voice trembling.
Negative, negative! We were walking down the thing! We were 1,000! And going down! The plane is uncontrollable!
And that's because of high vibration in the aircraft.
For everyone on board, the final plunge was a nightmare, lasting almost 3 minutes.
Whiskey, Charlie, whiskey.
When had Colonel Lourdes Ramos and her team interview friends and family of the pilots of West Caribbean Flight 708.
How was he when he was at home?
They uncover other long-standing issues that may help explain the crew's behavior.
West Caribbean Airlines was going through a very critical financial status.
Esto debido a una situación económica que atravesaba la empresa West Caribbean.
Because of West Caribbean's economic struggles, the crew members hadn't been paid for 6 months.
Tenían aproximadamente como 6 meses que no cobraban su...
And this could have influenced the captain's
De
concentration.
alguna otra manera influir en la concentración del capitán al momento de atender la emergencia.
Investigators discover that Captain Ospina was forced to take a second job, moonlighting in a bar, in order to make ends meet for his family.
Evidentemente, el nivel de estrés que
The level of stress that the captain was under because of his financial situation was huge.
presentaba es importante.
We solved the fuel situation yet?
I think we're getting close, Captain.
Before the accident, the crew was delayed in Colombia for hours because the airline couldn't pay for their fuel. That was their third of 4 flights that day.
La tripulación
The crew was under a lot of stress because they were already late and they didn't know if their flight would be canceled.
no se sabía si el vuelo se iba a cancelar.
It's a stop!
Investigators also believe that the 21-year-old first officer should have voiced his opinions more clearly.
Entre el capitán y el copiloto existía una
There was a considerable age difference between the captain and the co-pilot, and this might have intimidated the co-pilot when he needed to speak up.
dirigirse al capitán con autoridad.
Did I turn it on, Captain, or what?
Do we have ice?
No matter how young the co-pilots and the first officers are, how old and experienced the captain is, they have the right to preserve their life. If they see something that's going wrong,
Stop, Captain! It's a stop!
and they alert the captain, and he does not react, they should react by themselves.
The investigation's official report concludes that there was an insufficient level of situational awareness in both pilots.
Although the pilot's actions are in question in this flight, we also have to look at the operator. Did the operator provide proper training? We found that the training was insufficient, that they did not receive proper CRM training, and they did not receive proper stall training.
Este accidente ocurre por una cantidad de factores que no son
This accident happened as a result of numerous factors that aren't only attributable to the crew.
en el funcionamiento de
There were deplorable conditions in the operation of the airline,
estas son
and over time, these faults can lead to accidents.
y que en el transcurso del tiempo van afectando negativamente todo el funcionamiento de la empresa.
Negative! Negative! We're at 14,000 feet and the climate, both engines.
The report makes a long list of recommendations to ensure that the tragedy of Flight 708 never happens again.
Se hizo recomendaciones de seguridad a la Autoridad Aeronáutica Colombiana.
We made recommendations to the Colombian aviation authorities to improve pilot training, specifically better training in crew communication and having a better awareness about the use of the plane's autopilot.
Del uso del piloto automático en las aeronaves MD.
After this accident occurred, the airline was grounded and it never operated again. It went bankrupt and simply disappeared.
But West Caribbean Airways did leave a valuable legacy. Better safety measures for every other MD-80 taking to the skies today.